Hey folks, Steve here with another Prussia's Glory 1 video. We're going to be looking at the Battle of Zorndorf in this one. And I have set up just the battle scenario because I think this will give us plenty of fun action here. One that will not be one-sided, so I think for just my run through, the battle will be perfectly fine. And you can see that set up here. So we have the Prussians here in the south part of the map, and then the Russians in the north. So this is an Ushan battle, as it happens. And yes, I understand that Prussians are not necessarily related to the Russians because it's Prussian and all that good fun stuff. Just funs with words, guys. Turn track, as you can see, this is a really big turn track. So you could play up to 17 turns if you were playing from the main campaign or main scenario, which starts at 3 in the morning. This battle scenario starts at 9 in the morning and can run through turn 17. So really, I think in comparison to some of the other scenarios where the battle scenario starts kind of like halfway through, or even later than halfway through, where you have a lot more time, you know, relatively speaking, to maneuver. This one, we actually are going to have most of the turns of the whole scenario dedicated to the battle. But you still had, we look and see it's turn 7. Turn 7 means 7 turns of maneuver, which is quite a bit. I think the scenario has it that the Russians are kind of hanging out here, and I believe the Prussians start to come in, and then they cross the Meetzel River, and then there's sort of this like curve around to get into the Russian uh, get at the Russian position, because I think if my memory serves, Frederick wanted to do like another oblique attack, but just couldn't get the right angle on it, and so they wound up kind of in this position where, way over here to the east, underneath my scenario information, the heavy baggage train of the Russians was there. Frederick decided to ignore it and fight it out, but that led to a pretty um, stressful and prolonged battle, which we're going to see some version of here as we play out the battle. One of the things that this scenario has is special fatigue rules. So I don't know if you play BCS, this might not be too far off from that in some ways, where if your army, meaning your entire army, just even a little bit of your army, does anything like moving or combat and not just sitting there doing nothing, you're going to accrue 2 morale points worth of stuff. Now, the game says use any old marker, but you want to use markers of the same type, because if you rest, meaning you don't do anything on your turn activation, you can take some of those morale counters away and improve your morale. So there's not just losses counting against our morale in this scenario, but also this fatigue. Now, granted, if you look over here at the charts, you can see that the morale charts are much bigger than any of the previous battles that we've ever dealt with here. So I don't, there's obviously a fair number of units on the board. The morale is going to matter quite a bit. We're probably not going to have the luxury to sit and chill and accrue fatigue, or I'm sorry, recover fatigue. But at least we can look at the morale track being very big, and there being a lot of starting morale. The Russians start with 46 morale. The Prussians start with 34 morale, which is still a fair bit. So when you think about like, okay, we're going to start to lose units, um, plus the fatigue, maybe that number will go away quickly, and it's not as big as I think. Um, but this battle kind of has some tricky bits to it. So the terrain is kind of interesting. You've got kind of these gullies that are in the map. So this is raised terrain. This is raised terrain. This is raised terrain. You have down below in the stream these gullies, which means you probably don't want to get stuck down in there because it's going to be hard to get out, which kind of funnels some of the advancement. So historically, they fired on each other with artillery for a bit, and then the Prussian infantry started to advance around this way. Things got choppy. Seydlitz came around. There was a bunch of fighting. And then kind of from there, it just gets a little chaotic where, both sides are kind of fighting it out and not necessarily achieving a decisive victory before eventually the Prussians, as they were fighting sort of out and to the right, northeast, they wound up hanging out up here or up. They eventually were up here. The Russians had kind of shifted down this way, and it was kind of inconclusive. But the game scenario notes will note that the historically the historical result was a Prussian marginal victory. So the Russian morale is 6 or less, and the victory point differential is greater than 0, meaning the Prussians have more victory points than the Russians. So um, if the Prussians can achieve at least a historical victory, then great. If they can do better, then great. If nothing else happens, um, it's a Russian marginal victory. So we'll have to watch some of that stuff. We'll want to make sure the Prussians don't get demoralized. The Russians don't want to be demoralized. So it's going to just kind of be a straight up brawl, with the morale being an extra factor that we're going to need to think through, accommodate, find times when we can rest. One of the other things is several of these units, I guess, and I'll have to look to see if any of them, no, maybe they're in the secondary counterpool. I guess the last step of a lot of these units are parenthetical for the Prussians, which means they're in parentheses and they can't attack. So there's going to be an exhaustion point on an individual level where if a unit's taking too many hits, like it's just not going to want to attack at all. So you're going to want to pull them back anyway, but they're going to be out of the fight. So there's fewer Prussians than Russians. I think that's kind of par for course for a lot of the scenarios we've seen. The Prussians are going to have to lean on um, their capabilities to make a difference here. And we'll have to watch out because there are some Cossacks on the Russian left up there that could pose a problem if they swing in and generate some pain. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of how this plays out. Very generally speaking, the Prussians have an effectiveness rating of 4, all except for the Dono wing here in sort of tan, or I don't know what you would call that, beige, light yellow. But I've put Frederick with the leader so that if they fail to get effectiveness, he has another chance to roll. He's actually worse in this scenario than in previous ones where he's only a 4 initiative. So that could be a difference here, a difference maker. But generally, all the Prussian units on the board will have a 66% chance of being effective for movement purposes. The Russians only have scores of 3 for their infantry and cavalry. They have 1 crappy wing, which only has a value of 2, which is why I've put Firmer, their commander, on that stack to make it a 3 effectively. So the Russians, by comparison, only have a 50% chance of having full effectiveness, but they're really on the defensive, we might say, for the most part, so they don't necessarily have a need to move around quite as much as the Prussians. So I think this is going to be an interesting battle for sure, to play out and see what happens. I think Leuthen was very interesting. This one I feel like is even more challenging. Well, Leuthen should not have been a challenge for the Prussians. I just played them badly, and I played the Austrians well in the last battle. This one, there is not really any advantage that the Prussians have except for in their unit quality for morale. Positionally, this looks like just a straight up fight, right? All the units are kind of lined up in rows. The terrain, at least to start with, we're in a lot of flat ground. Then we get into the gullies, which could make things choppy. You might funnel the Prussians into a certain position that they may not like compared to the Russians if the Russians can get set up a certain way. So certainly going to make for an interesting battle. With the fatigue rules, I'm going to have to be really careful to remember to mark that. And what I've done, because I don't trust that I'm going to have enough markers to make sense of the morale losses, I'm using my famous colored tokens that I'm also using for nations and arms to track. So black for Prussia, green for Russia. So if they do something that would incur morale, I'll take 2 of these wooden discs and put them on the morale track to represent that, rather than some arbitrary game function counter that I might actually need, and I don't want to deprive myself of that. So there you go. Okay, guys, we'll get started as usual. We start with the Prussian player turn. I think they're going to want to move some units up to uh, protect that artillery. That seems like an obvious thing to try to do, but besides that, I'm not sure what exactly I want to do. I think it makes sense to start approaching the Russian right, like was historical maybe, but there could be folly with that as well. We'll see what happens. Okay, here we are after the Prussian half of the first turn of the battle. I just want to call out kind of the thought process and what I'm trying to achieve here before I do the Russians. Ordinarily, I would just show you, the end of the turn before the beginning of the next one, but just the framing of the battle is kind of interesting here. So, in terms of activations, the Dona wing actually failed to activate, and then, or not failed to activate, but was degraded. I tried to use, and I knew this would happen, so I had Frederick stacked with the leader here to try a special attempt to get them back into efficient order, and that failed. So these guys couldn't move very far, and then we had these artillery starting out up. These artillery were up here, kind of exposed, because it is conceivable that a Russian cavalry could come down and cause some havoc and capture some artillery. So I used their movement to pull back. So they're at least together. They're just a refused flank at the moment. Um, so everyone sort of just moved forward. It takes some time to get through the slopes of the hill. So we were able to get units that are part of Kanitz, his infantry and some units, as well as Montufel, protecting these artillery and then being able to operate. And then our cavalry, our reserve cavalry in the form of Bieberstein, and then Seydlitz have come out around. But you can see I'm keeping them on that hill. I don't want to have to climb back up the hill. So they're kind of up, and then you have that gully here. So they're kind of getting in position as they historically were off to the left here. Now, um, I'm making a sacrifice here, because what I could have done is sent the blue wing to the right. And there's a reason why I could have done that, or maybe should have done that. But what I'd like to do is have a strong left flank with the cavalry, because I hope, or I expect to try to make very good use of them to disrupt the Russians with as much decent cavalry as I can. But the reason why I would have maybe put them to the east here on the right flank is that if you look at this green wing, we have three pretty good, in terms of morale, cavalry units, but opposing them is what is functionally six Russian, like Cossack, or no, they're not. Maybe they're not Cossacks, but Russian cavalry on their left here, this left wing. So while like on a 1-to-1 basis, the Prussian cavalry might be better in most cases, they're outnumbered, which means that they could much more easily get outflanked and wrapped up and be forced to basically, um, uh, what could happen? These guys could come around them, beat them on a flanking attack, and then start to roll up the Prussian line, maybe. And I don't want that to happen. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to probably have a refused flank here. Keep these guys back here. They're anchored on Wilkersdorf, because if the Russians do move through the town, they're going to have a hard time attacking out of it due to the penalties. So we can kind of use this as an additional segment of the line that protects us, and we can kind of hold here. I am going to want to move these guys up to some degree, but we're going to want to keep some level of flank against the cavalry here so that they can't disrupt us, where we do push more heavily against the Russian right and hopefully disrupt them heavily enough that we'll clear them out of this area. And that's going to mean approaching with this artillery, using the cavalry to kind of sneak back out around as best we can. Certainly think we'll be able to do that. The Russian right cavalry is actually pretty weak. Like their strength numbers aren't great, their morale numbers aren't great. So if we can get in and around them, beat their cavalry with our cavalry, turn that into some momentum advances against these infantry, we could start to push them back. We were able to do some artillery bombardment, and we got a lucky die roll and caused a step loss to this guy. So he went from 8 strength and 7 morale to 7 strength and 7 morale. So that is a very tough Russian infantry unit. So that it's going to be some tough fighting to figure out exactly, how do we best actually create that breaking point, and it's going to be tricky because again that slope, the gullies, and then the hill structure kind of makes it a little tricky to actually get in to a good position and avoid the penalties for attack. So there's definitely a puzzle here to figure out, like, what do we want to do. I alternatively could have sent the blue wing over here, and then it's a little more even in terms of fending off this cavalry, and we could be a little more offensive minded. But if I won the cavalry fight, it's going to be a little bit harder. I mean, I guess depending on how things would go, trying to get up over here seems more difficult than the approach that I'm taking over here, where we can amass greater numbers. Now, this is historically where the Prussians pushed and fought, and it got kind of hairy there for a while, and I'm expecting that to be the case because again, that like these Russians have pretty good morale. This unit in particular, and facing it are going to be actually less morale savvy Prussians in some cases. So we might have to figure out how do we adjust the line. Like our infantry, like there's a good infantry there, but he's back with Dona, who's not going to activate very often. So we could try to do something where we swap and we move Dona's wing over here, and then we shift the red and the brown wings over here and kind of swap them out and have some higher morale units facing the higher morale Russians. But that's kind of an expensive move, and given every time we move we take morale loss, that seems expensive. And you'll see that I did put my 2 black markers on for morale on the Prussians for doing their active movement here. So we'll see what the Russians can do in response. I'm not sure that there's much that they want to do. They're going to have to just figure out, like, do they move up? Do they get into a good position to attack or defense or whatever? Maybe the cavalry can get moving. The only problem will be that the efficiency ratings for the Russian activations are pretty bad. So there's a high likelihood that the Russians aren't even going to be able to move much at all in this activation. So it could be maybe if they're all degraded, maybe they don't move at all and they don't accrue the morale loss. That might be worthwhile to do. But I'll show you the aftermath of the Russian turn here next, and we'll see how things get going. Okay, here we are after the Russian first turn. And where'd that cavalry go? Well, they're starting to come out around. And I think the idea being, like, either these guys continue around or maybe these guys come around this way. Either way, we want to be operating in the Prussian backfield and just causing them some havoc to disrupt them. So just going from up here to down here is a very clear threat to them. The cavalry managed to be efficient this turn, so these guys could all move pretty far. They don't want to get caught up in the town, but they can kind of, pivot whichever way they want. So this is a threat to the Prussian position, and the Prussians are going to have to do something about this. When we look at the morale again, Prussians kind of have an advantage on morale. They could go for this stack. Problem is it's a 2 deep stack. It's got support, so they could get bogged down trying to take these guys out, and that leaves them open to these guys sort of surging ahead and maybe hitting these guys. The artillery protects them a bit, but
it does present a problem for the Prussians. Otherwise, the Russians were largely degraded for movement, so they couldn't do much. We've got a couple of adjustments around with the artillery. I would like to get this artillery over here, but he's kind of stuck in the gully due to the movement penalties that the light baggage train produces all around here. And it's kind of a problem. I'd really like to move them, but he's actually stuck down in a gully and doesn't have enough movement to really get anywhere due to being degraded. So it's kind of a problem. The Russians are going to have just moving things around until we can try to get that unit clear somehow. Um, Over here on the far side, I actually pulled back the right wing cavalry, pulled them back to here, and adjusted some infantry and some artillery facing this way. This is so that we don't see a crushing cavalry duel where these guys get pushed way out of the way. What we want them to do is have to fight some formed infantry and potentially go uphill if they really want to. And should they become disordered fighting the infantry, that's when this cavalry comes back across somehow or some way and attacks the disrupted Prussians. And so you can kind of see like it, with the luxury of defense that the Russians have here, like they're on defense. If nothing changes, if both sides just sit here for the rest of the battle, the Russians win. So it's like I can think through how do I create a stout defense where I'm at, and then how do I pose a threat to my enemy's flank. So for whatever reason, it's sort of like with Leuthen, I'm playing the coalition. It feels like pretty good, and maybe that's just the impetus of like we are at a natural disadvantage by being on defense in this scenario. In Leuthen, we were likewise kind of like I have to make up for the fact that the Prussians have to jump on the Austrians. So that's just propelling me forward to perform better, maybe is what it is. Um, but when we return to the Prussian perspective, it's like, okay, what can we do? We could maybe try to fend off that cavalry. I am now wondering, do I try to pull the blue wing back? But we've kind of committed to something here, um, and I may need to just accept it. Or I bring them across and down through and maybe come up this way and sort of, do their own flank while these cavalry units fight off the blue formation of the Russians. I don't know. But it feels like maybe me sending the blue wing over here was a mistake as the Prussians, as things start to evolve and I see things differently. The gullies are going to, these little valleys, these gullies are going to be a challenge because once you're down in there, it's that much harder to get out of them, especially if you become degraded, then you're really having a hard time crawling out. And even with these woods that have the potential to create disordered units trying to move through them. Technically, that's an optional rule, but one that I want to play with. It's like, the Russians have artillery that can fire down this way. They have artillery that can oops, um, fire. So the fire arcs of the Russian artillery are pretty solid. So it may just come down to the Prussians just advancing, making incremental progress and assaulting the positions and hoping for the best. Hard to say. But anyway, I think from here, I'm not going to show the results of each player turn. I'm going to go back to showing the end result of each turn. But I did want to show you guys, like, okay, even some minor adjustments change the perspective on what could happen next and where each side wants to focus its efforts on as the battle evolves. So we'll go and do the 10 a.m. turn, I guess, next is the Prussians. Okay, here we are in the aftermath of the 10 a.m. turn. It was really an approach turn with a lot of artillery firing, which is historical. The only thing that is sad for the Russians is that they missed every single one, even one where they combined fire here. They rolled a one, and so got zero results. So really seeing the problems of inferior Russian artillery, where now the Prussians, if they choose not to directly engage, could actually start firing and have a much better chance of denuding Russian strength and may force the Russians to actually come out to attack from their line, while the cavalry kind of wait in the wings, waiting to find some disordered units, because ideally they what we want to have happen is the artillery softens up the Russian infantry, and then we can make some cavalry attacks. But crossing that gully is going to be a problem. That gulch, whatever you want to call it. Over in the east, the cavalry battle is actually so far going against the Russians. They really thought they were going to maybe be in a better position, but the Prussians attacked first, managed to roll reasonably well, and then in what could have been a very good combat for both the Russians, they rolled reasonably low and find themselves one with a routed unit that's recovered and another routed unit. So these Russian units are kind of getting pushed away. Um, while the Prussians had designated a couple of infantry to kind of sit back and kind of guard the rear, just projecting some Zocs, so it costs more movement to try to get around the Prussian position, so that where there's some level of safety. That means we're weakening ourselves elsewhere a little bit, but I think a methodical approach, kind of waiting things out, is probably appropriate. What I do need to look at is if we hang back, the cavalry fighting is forcing the the morale losses for the heat, for fatiguing. But I'm wondering if, and of course we're moving other stuff, but if we just sit tight and fire only artillery, does that if we only fire offensive bombardment, does that mean we don't need to add fatigue? I'm going to have to look at the rule for that. But we're going to go into the 1100 turn, 1100, 11 a.m. Still many turns to go. So I feel like this pace is fine. We're slowly beginning the engagement while a cavalry battle decides the flanking opportunities. If the Prussians get away with totally dispersing that Russian cavalry, then they're going to be in a really good spot to kind of envelop the Russian position, but it could go either way. We'll see what happens. Okay, I've actually played through a couple of turns and we're now at 2 p.m. And what's funny is I've done very little in terms of actual fighting of the main forces. It's mostly been an artillery duel that, generally speaking, the Prussians have come out ahead, though some Prussians did get scared away by this network of firing arcs, which is this disordered guy you see here. Um, However, on the right flank of the Prussians, we did actually manage to get in here enough that a Prussian unit, this sort of sole unit that could kind of walk up and get into the action, had captured some of the steps of a Russian artillery and then just got pushed out by the surrounding Russian units. Um, and it's kind of getting to the point now where we just need to move forward with these guys, waiting for a decent activation to just get in there and try something, especially because over the long haul, the sheer numbers of the Russians have actually finally won out on this sort of cavalry battle over here. So there were some routed units that have sort of recovered, and unfortunately for the Prussians, they don't have much else left in terms of cavalry on the right. So we're rushing that blue formation. This might just be enough to make the difference, um, to fend off the remnant Russian cavalry. So it's going to be kind of a tough thing to see just exactly what happens. It could be that these guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, have just enough movement to get over here, chop these guys up, and then by the time those guys could be coming over, the Prussians are sitting pretty happy. Um, but it's now kind of gotten to the point, while I've been allowing these guys to kind of be far apart firing artillery, we can't keep this up forever, or else even the French are going to wear themselves out. So they're going to have to do something. Um, and I've tried to look for opportunities for both sides to get some relief for their fatigue. But the reality is, like, so long as you're being hit with cannon, which both sides are hitting each other with cannon, there's just no saving yourself from fatigue. And right now it stands. You can see there's a lot of fatigue hitting morale. Russian morale is at 29. Prussian morale is doing a little bit better because they've come out ahead on combat successes, but even they're at 21, which, I mean, I guess they've lost a fair bit of morale, but the Russians have lost more morale over the long haul of things. So I kind of see this as Um, if things keep up the way that they're going, the Prussians may just win this one because they're losing morale at a slower pace, but and the combat successes are giving them some help, but they're still dealing with a lot of units, being chopped up. So we'll see what happens. I mean, when I look at it, there's still many turns left. Like we have as many turns left as there were in like the Leuten scenario. So this is still anybody's scenario as far as I can tell. But no more firing artillery. Someone's just going to have to rush in there and start fighting the good fight. But how that breaks out will be dependent on how the cavalry things go. I do think that we're going to see probably something happen where we make a push from the right as the Prussians, and as the Russians. Well, we'll have to see. It's kind of tough. Like, do you abandon the tops of the hills? You don't want to get stuck in those gullies or those gulches. So you really don't have a lot of maneuvering space as the Russians to do much of anything, even when you're effective. And to be honest, the Russians have been degraded more than anything here. So um, it's tense to see just where things are going to break out. Okay, here we are at what will be the beginning of the 3 p.m. turn. If I'm counting right, I'm pretty sure I am. Things like they're coming, looks like they're coming to a head here where we ought to be able to see. Well, it's kind of hard to say. So the Prussian blue wing came back and eliminated the Russian cavalry there, and are basically wondering, are they going to have to deal with this guy? Are they going to have to deal with this guy? These are pretty weak morale Russian units. There's not as much to worry about. These guys can get back into good order and probably actually come up here and cause some havoc that way. So it's a matter of like, will these guys come back and will they be able to do anything of real worth or value to hurt the Prussians? Or can these guys, when they rally, assuming they rally, do they start coming up here and getting behind the Russians, maybe capturing that guy right there, something along those lines? You can see there are some routing units. The Prussians are starting to run into some tough Russian units, so that's starting to slow things down. And then we did have a sweeping attack through here that kind of has put these Prussian cavalry, heavy cavalry, in a bit of a pickle. But so far, the Russians haven't been able to make use of it, and they've rolled pretty poorly. So we're starting to see, a case where things are, they're starting to get pushed back. There's no chance of getting out of fatigue. And so it's really now just grinding into the Russians. And I do think that there's a potential here that the Prussians could break against the Russians, but I just don't know. There's still Russian artillery on the board. Um, uh, so it's kind of, it's tough to say exactly how things are going to pan out from here. Um, but we'll have to see. Yeah, I don't know. The Prussians have already captured several bits of Russian artillery and forced things back. It's really hard to capture all of a Russian artillery unit in one go because they have such high morale. Um, but it's definitely putting the hurt on. Russian morale is also plummeting, so they're down to 16 morale, which it's still a long ways to go before they're demoralized, but it's starting to happen. Whereas all the recent successes have bolstered Prussian morale, that they're actually, things are stacking up here on the 21 morale state. So for the first time all scenario, the Russian morale has dropped below the Prussian morale. And if things don't get better for the Russians, I mean, just due to sheer exhaustion, will they probably demoralize? And if the Prussians can keep getting combat successes, they can offset the fatigue that they're feeling. At least I'm treating the morale markers like anything else, that if you have enough combat success, you can shift the markers up like other things. I don't know. I might have to double check that. And if it turns out that that is not the case, then I can adjust that. But the Prussians are at least staving off the worst of things. They might have to pull back to rest at some point, but that would just open them up to being hit with Russian artillery. So I don't think they really want to do that if they can help it. And it's really hard to disengage already. We're already in the tarball kind of thing. So we'll keep playing through and show what happens. Okay, here we are at what will be the beginning of the 4 p.m. 1600 hour turn. The Russians are kind of broken, but the Prussians are starting to be bled pretty badly here. The morale, Russian morale is down to 3 based on routing units, but it did pass its morale check for the army. Prussians are sitting at 15 morale, so they still have a little ways to go. It's kind of hard to see where the Russians come back from this because I think the Prussians at this point should be able to basically clean out the rest of the units on the board. These Russian cavalry are trying to come back to do something, but they may not get back in time. And while the Russians are kind of restoring some sort of line here, you can see. I mean, the Prussians are just going to kind of come in here and clean up. Is probably what's going to happen. Um, so it kind of got a little mixed up. We've not had any chance for. Oh, you know what? I did forget. Um, Ooh, I forgot to do the fatigue for this turn. Hold on, guys. Let me fix that because that might mean the Russians demoralize. Okay, after a really quick recalculation, the Russians are down to 1 morale, a morale of 1, but they still pass their morale check of 5. That was their die roll there, that 5. So barely hanging on. The Russians have not actually broken or demoralized somehow. Tough fighting through these hills. Things are getting kind of crazy. But I do think it's probably going to be a Prussian victory at this point. The question is going to be how big a victory will it ultimately end up being? So I'll play it through. I may just play through the rest of the turns and show you guys the aftermath, but this was a hard fought battle for sure. I do think the cavalry distraction was kind of a key thing to victory, but we'll see. Okay, here we are late in the game. This is the start of the 6 p.m. turn, 1800. The Russian army is broken. The Prussian army has avoided demoralization. There is a set of routed units trying to get to the bridge to get out of here. Since the way I interpret the rule is you can't cross this river because it's prohibited terrain if you're just routed. That seems to be how the rule works in my mind. And everything else is just kind of in really bad shape. There's a few stalwart Russian units that have, by some miracle, passed morale checks and are here, but they're kind of in a really bad position, and they're going to be in some deep trouble here. The other thing is if you're playing with the woods rule and a unit retreats into the woods, I can't tell, like, do you just keep suffering retreat, route the whole way through the forest? I doubt it works like that, but basically, if you retreat into the woods, then you will likely. It's a very strong possibility that you're going to suffer a rout and disordering, and so it's kind of a bad situation for the Russians. This will certainly be a Prussian victory, but we're going to find out just how severe of a Prussian victory here. I'm going to play out the last couple of turns and just see how the rest of this stuff breaks out. Well, guys, I did the calculation. So the Russian army being broken, the Prussians never actually becoming demoralized, and the victory point differential is way over 30 in the Prussians' favor. So we would call this a Prussian decisive victory, which is better than historical for the Prussians. The battle was inconsequential, or not inconsequential. Um, Okay, sorry for the weird cut there. Something was up with my recording device, and that is resolved. So yeah, historically, the battle was indecisive, but in this case, this was a quite decisive victory for the Prussians. Um, there's definitely, what I wonder when I look at the way the game works is, there's not necessarily what do you call it? There's not an automatic victory condition. So there are certain points where it's like, oh, what should I do anything more? Should I just keep routing the Russians off the field and kill as many units as I can? Um, the only thing that puts me in danger of is what if I roll very badly and one of the Prussian units routes, and maybe that would bring me down just enough to become demoralized. But you're always maybe better off eliminating units and routing stuff because that gives you the combat successes to offset any losses. Kind of a weird thing. I think there was definitely a point where maybe it was like, I don't know, turn 15, 14 or 15, the 1600 and 1700 turns, that I'm pretty sure the Prussians were like, yeah, we got it. We won. We did it. And we still ended up losing some of our artillery to Russians, just sort of like on their last legs, capturing some Prussian artillery. That doesn't even seem that far off the history because there were cases where both sides were like going back and forth capturing artillery. There's no mechanic for that specifically. So if you capture an artillery unit, it just comes off the map. But it doesn't take that much to actually lose your artillery, especially if you are attacking and you have one unit left stacked with artillery, and that attacking unit is destroyed. The one special exception to most of the war games you would play is, in this case, the defender can advance after combat to take artillery, and that definitely happened to the Prussians as the Russians were able to get in there. So um, the only other thing I could imagine I could have done, maybe should have done, as the Prussians is after we had them pretty much like on the on the major retreat path, we could have held back, maybe not moved, not done anything, and regained some morale by getting rid of the fatigue markers. But it just didn't seem like, I don't know. It seemed like I could beat that by uh, operating with combat successes and just keeping it rolling. Quickly, I want to try to look at the rules again around fatigue. It's like you can see the rules there. Um, yeah, I mean, there's nothing that for sure says that you can't shift those markers up if you get the right number of combat successes. So I think you're fine to shift the morale markers. It's just that you can also get rid of them by resting. So I think I don't know, that would be one of those things like to check an errata in any errata. It's not in any errata that I can find that's published, but like, is there a special case where for the morale markers you accrue for fatigue, like those don't shift up for combat success? And I could definitely see a house rule either way where somebody says that yes, or rather no, combat successes don't allow you to shift the fatigue markers because fatigue's just wearing on you even if you're winning. But the base rule seems to be that you can offset fatigue by success. And I'm really split there. I could see it either way. Like you might be tired, but if you're seeing your enemies getting whacked, that might be just enough to give you enough energy to keep going. So that was kind of an interesting thing. That fatigue rule is used in some other battles in Prussia's Glory 2. This is just the one game that happens to be in effect in this scenario. So, yeah, so this is third battle down. I think this is another good one that it didn't seem like I really need to play the main scenario to have an interesting situation. So even the battle was still pretty interesting. I think if I had done the main scenario right, you could maybe see where there'd be a fight, maybe more over here, um, than what we had, where it was really focused in the historical spot. The tricky thing is if you're playing with the woods rule, where if you enter into a woods hex, it's possible you'll become disordered. That could be really nasty in this scenario because you do eventually get to the point where you hit the forest, And I also made a leap. I'm not sure the rules expressly say this, but for this river, actually, it's probably on the terrain chart. I don't know what I'm talking about. Um, let's see. Yeah, Mitchell River, you basically have to be in column to move across the river. So if you're not in column and you're retreating or you're deployed formation, whatever, like that's prohibited terrain to try to cross. Like you will be eliminated if you're forced to retreat into the river. Is how I read that. Because well, I don't know. That's one of those tough things. It seems like, well, maybe not. I don't know. So maybe you can retreat over the Meitzel River, but you can't. You have to be in column if you're going to move it across, naturally, I guess. And what I ended up doing, because I was like, well, maybe they're not allowed to route over the rivers. I had them go to the bridge, so all the Russians started filtering, this way to get to a retreat edge, which maybe, it's probably just as valid, maybe. I don't know. I think this is differentiated from Torgau, where the scenario where the Elbe River is, where the Elbe River is prohibited terrain in the terrain chart, where this is not. So I maybe could have retreated over that river if we really needed to as the Russians. But it does cause kind of like an interesting terrain situation where, maybe if we had forced the Russians to retreat across the river and both sides aren't willing to go in a column movement to get across, like that's a way that both sides can hang back and try to recuperate while the timer's ticking. I don't know. But I would definitely say like this scenario was as interesting as Leuten, if maybe not more so, because here it really did feel like, the Prussians have a really hard time. And that must be what I'm up to. Like every battle besides Rossbach, where the side that is disadvantages or is perceived to have challenges, I try harder to overcome those challenges and they end up winning. So that may just be a personal effect of myself playing these games. Um, but generally, this was a good scenario. It was kind of interesting. The terrain puzzles made things a little more challenging, um, and obviously the effectiveness will change what the Russians can do. If you get a good cavalry activation, you might do what I did and try to fight down here with that left wing cavalry. But if you roll crap, then maybe you keep those guys held back, which is what historically happened with those cavalry, I think. And then they fought sort of over here against some Prussians, and you almost had like a concave formation of the Prussians fighting off the Russians, and they ended up having to pull back and around, and you got the historical things. What I don't see happening is necessarily the sort of retrograde movement that the historical battle had, where the positioning of units, they kind of separated and drifted out this way. I'm not sure you would really see that in this scenario, because once you're engaged, you're just going to keep fighting. It's really hard to get away, um, unless you do. I guess you could do a voluntary retreat, but even then, the enemy can advance after combat. So it's just very tough to figure out, like, how would you disengage. The fatigue rules would be, I guess, more impactful if you really could try to back off as much as you can. But what I feel is going to happen most of the time in this battle is both sides will end up colliding, and neither side will ever get a real chance to restore fatigue. Because again, if you are fired upon by artillery, then you take fatigue. If you move, you take fatigue, and if you have combat, you take fatigue. So you literally have to do like nothing. You can fire at the enemy, but if they fire back at you, that turn you'll accrue fatigue. So it's an interesting mechanic for the battle, but I feel like unless you're very cautious, where I tend to be very aggressive playing solitaire because just I want to see things happen. You won't recover much fatigue at all, is what it seems like. Anyway, that was the Battle of Zorndorf, guys. There is one battle left in the box for Prussia's Glory 1, which would be the Battle of Torgau. That's going to be the next one. I got to punch the counters, round them, and get organized for that. But hopefully, I'll get that to you guys in the somewhat near future, and we'll wrap up a basic review for Prussia's Glory 1 here in the near future. So thanks for watching. Take care, guys. Keep gaming.